The dust of redemption, Wyoming, tasted like broken promises. I should know. I'd been swallowing it for 6 months, ever since the stagecoach left me and my teaching degree on the edge of nowhere. My name is Eleanor Vance, and my one-room schoolhouse was filled with more hope than students. But today was different. Today, the Orphan train was coming, a real locomotive, chuffing its way across the plains, carrying a cargo of second chances. For the children, and for us. The whole town was gathered at the makeshift platform. Wives sizing up little girls who might help with the mending. Farmers eyeing boys with broad shoulders who could learn to buck hay. There was a nervous energy in the air, a mix of charity and calculation. I stood by the station master, my clipboard in hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. My job was simple: to be the children's advocate, to make sure every soul found a decent home. It was my most important lesson. Then I saw him. He wasn't with the townsfolk. He stood apart, over by the water tower, a silhouette against the unforgiving sun. Tall, broad, and still as a headstone. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on the tracks. Silas Blackwood, a name whispered in the general store, a name that made children hurry home before dusk. He owned the old Crying Creek Ranch, a spread so isolated they said the coyotes got lonely. He came to town once a month for supplies, never said more than 3 words, and paid in dusty coin. They said he had ice in his veins. They said he'd wrestled a wolf and won. They said he was a man with a past best left buried. And he was here, at the station, on the one day hope was supposed to arrive. A cold dread washed over me. What could a man like that possibly want with an orphan? The train whistle blew, a long, mournful cry that echoed off the bluffs. The townsfolk surged forward, their faces bright with anticipation. But I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow by the water tower. He didn't move a muscle. He just watched and waited. The children spilled out onto the platform, blinking in the harsh sunlight. They were a motley crew, weary from 1,000 miles of track, dressed in donated clothes that didn't quite fit. I put on my best teacher smile, moving among them, straightening a collar here, patting a shoulder there. "Welcome to redemption," I said, my voice louder than I intended. The pairings began quickly. The Millers, who ran the mercantile, took a rosy-cheeked girl of 10. The blacksmith, a giant of a man with a booming laugh, chose a skinny boy who looked like he could shinny up a chimney. One by one, the children were claimed. Each time, a small part of the weight on my shoulders lifted. I saw Silas Blackwood shift. He pushed off the water tower and drifted closer, staying at the edge of the crowd. He was like a hawk circling a chicken coop. I moved instinctively, putting myself between him and the remaining children. He wasn't getting one. Not while I was here. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the splintered wood of the platform. The crowd thinned. Soon there were only 5 children left. Then 4. Then 3. They huddled together, a tiny island in a sea of departing families. Caleb, the oldest, maybe 12. He had the fierce, protective eyes of a boy forced to be a man too soon. In the middle was Lily, clutching a worn-out rag doll, her face smudged with tears she refused to let fall. And clinging to her other hand was little Finn, no older than 5, his thumb stuck firmly in his mouth, his eyes wide with a terror that broke my heart. They were siblings, it was plain to see. And that was the problem. No one wanted 3. It was too many mouths to feed, too many futures to gamble on. Reverend Michael cleared his throat beside me. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low and sorrowful, "we knew this might happen. Perhaps we can find a place for the boy. The other 2 might have to go back." "No," I whispered. "You can't separate them." "We have no choice," he sighed. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. The train was already building steam for its return journey. This was it. Failure. The promise of redemption was turning to ash right before my eyes. Caleb pulled his sister and brother closer, his small body a shield against the world. And that's when Silas Blackwood finally moved. He walked forward, his heavy boots echoing on the platform. The few remaining townsfolk parted before him like the Red Sea. He stopped a few feet from the children, his shadow falling over them. He was even bigger up close, his face a road map of hard miles and old pain, a faded scar cutting across one cheek. He said nothing, He just looked down at the three orphans. Caleb stared back, defiant. Lily hid her face behind her doll. Finn just trembled. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The station master looked at the Reverend. The Reverend looked at me. I held my breath, my hand gripping my clipboard so tightly my knuckles were white. I was ready to step in, to say something, anything, to send this monster of a man away. Then he spoke. His voice was like rocks grinding together, rusty from disuse. "I'll take them." The Reverend blinked. I I beg your pardon, Mr. Blackwood." Silas Blackwood didn't look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the children. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He tossed it to the Reverend. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud. "I said," he repeated, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "I'll take them all." My mind reeled. The Reverend fumbled with the pouch, his eyes going wide as he looked inside. Gold coin. More than enough to satisfy the agency's requirements. Far more. This wasn't charity, it was a purchase. "Mr. Blackwood," I stammered, finding my voice, "this is highly irregular. These children need a proper home. A, a family environment." He finally turned his eyes on me. They were gray as a storm cloud and held a weariness so profound it stole the air from my lungs. "They'll be together. They'll be fed. That's the deal." He wasn't wrong. The agency's rules were clear. A solvent guardian was all that was legally required. The Reverend, clutching the gold, nodded slowly. "The paperwork seems to be in order." My protest died in my throat. It was happening. This silent, scarred stranger, this phantom from the hills, was walking away with the last three children. He turned and started toward his wagon without another word. But the children didn't move. They were frozen, terrified. "Go on," the Reverend urged them gently. Caleb looked at me, his eyes screaming a question I couldn't answer. I felt like a traitor. My one job was to protect them, and I was handing them over to a ghost story. I couldn't let it happen. Not like this. "Wait," I called out, my voice sharp. Silas Blackwood stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm coming with you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could think. "The agency requires a follow-up visit. I'll perform it now, to ensure they are settled properly." It was a lie, a desperate, flimsy lie. There was a follow-up, but it was meant to be weeks later. But I saw the flicker of hesitation in the Reverend's eyes and the bloom of hope in Caleb's. Silas stood with his back to me for a long moment. I expected him to refuse, to tell me to go to hell. Instead, he just shrugged his massive shoulders. "Wagons over there." And just like that, I was riding out of town with the quiet cowboy and his three new children, heading toward a place called Crying Creek. The name felt like a terrible omen. The journey was made in a silence as vast and empty as the landscape around us. The wagon creaked and groaned, a mournful rhythm against the steady plod of the two big horses. Silas Blackwood handled the reins with an easy, practiced grace, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw set like granite. He never spoke. Not to me, not to the children. Caleb sat beside him on the buckboard, stiff as a poker, pretending to be brave. Lily and Finn were in the back with me, huddled amid sacks of flour and salt. Lily whispered stories to her rag doll, her voice a tiny thread of sound in the overwhelming quiet. Finn had fallen into an exhausted sleep, his small head resting on my lap. I studied the back of Silas Blackwood's head. Who was this man? Why, after years of shunning the world, would he suddenly take on the burden of three children? The gold coins proved he had money, but he didn't look rich. His clothes were worn, his wagon was old, and the horses, while strong, were not fancy stock. Nothing about it made sense. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The land grew rougher, the trail narrower. We were leaving civilization far behind. Every rock and twisted juniper seemed to cast a longer, more menacing shadow. My earlier bravado had curdled into a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach. What had I done? I was a school teacher, not an adventurer. I had no weapon, no plan. I was completely at this man's mercy. Just as true darkness fell, we crested a ridge. Below us, nestled in a hollow carved by a thin winding creek, was a single point of light, a lamp in a window. Crying Creek Ranch. It was not a welcoming sight. The ranch was a collection of dark, angular buildings huddled together as if for warmth. The main house was a long, low structure made of dark timber with a sagging porch and shuttered windows. The barn was a hulking shape beside it, and a few corrals stood empty and stark under the rising moon. There were no other lights for miles. We were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Silas brought the wagon to a halt near the house. He climbed down without a word and began unhitching the horses. He moved with a weary efficiency, his large frame flowing through the familiar motions. "Caleb," he said, his voice startling me, "help me with the team." Caleb scrambled down, eager to prove his worth. I helped a sleepy Finn and a frightened Lily out of the back of the wagon. The air was cold here, much colder than in town. It smelled of pine and damp earth. "Inside," Silas grunted, gesturing with his head toward the house. The door opened into one large room. A stone fireplace stood cold at one end. A long table with benches dominated the center. The furniture was simple, handmade, and worn smooth with use. It was obsessively clean, but it felt empty. There were no pictures on the walls, no rugs on the floor, no curtains in the windows. It wasn't a home, it was a barracks. A pot of something, stew by the smell of it, was simmering on the hearth. So he had been expecting company, or at least he had prepared for it. The thought sent another shiver down my spine. He ladled the stew into 4 bowls and set them on the table with a loaf of dark bread. He didn't make a bowl for himself. He just stood by the fire, watching us. The children ate like starving wolves. I barely touched mine, my appetite gone. The silence in the room was louder than the journey had been. It was a heavy, suffocating thing. When they were finished, Silas took the bowls. He pointed down a dark hallway. "Second door on the right, your room." He was speaking to the children. Then he looked at me. "First door, sleep well." He turned and walked back toward the fire, his footsteps unnervingly quiet for such a big man. I led the children down the hall. Their room was as sparse as the main one. 2 small beds with clean but threadbare blankets. A single crate stood between them to serve as a nightstand. I tucked Lily and Finn into one bed. Caleb took the other, his eyes still wide and watchful. "He's strange, Miss Vance," Caleb whispered from the darkness. "He is," I agreed. "But you're safe. I'm right next door. I'm not going anywhere." I tried to make it sound like a promise. It felt more like a prayer. I went to my own room. It was a mirror of the children's, just a bed and a crate. I was too wired to sleep. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of the old house. The wind moaned around the eaves. The floorboards creaked. And then I saw it. At the very end of the dark hallway, there was another door. Unlike the others, this one was different. It was made of thick, heavy planks, and across it was a heavy iron bolt. It was locked, padlocked from the outside. My blood ran cold. Why would a man who lived alone need to lock a room in his own house with a bolt that could hold back a grizzly? What in God's name was he hiding behind that door? I spent the rest of the night staring into the darkness, listening. Sometime in the deep hours, I heard footsteps in the hall. They didn't go to the main room or outside. They stopped right in front of that bolted door. I heard a faint sound, a soft scraping, as if a hand was tracing the wood. Then a whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. A single grief-choked word. "Anna." Who was Anna? And why was her memory locked away behind iron and wood? The first few days at Crying Creek Ranch passed in a haze of tense routine. Silas Blackwood was a creature of habit. Up before the sun, he'd work until long after it set. He mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, and chopped enough firewood to survive a decade-long winter. He provided for the children, but he was not a father. He was a warden. He spoke only when necessary, issuing quiet commands. "Caleb, fetch water. Lily, feed the chickens." He never used their names otherwise. He never smiled. He never offered a word of comfort or praise. He moved around them like a ghost, present in body, but absent in spirit. The children, in turn, were terrified of him. They did their chores with a silent, fearful efficiency. Lily stopped talking to her doll. Finn stopped sucking his thumb. They became smaller, quieter versions of themselves, as if trying to take up as little space as possible in this strange, sad house. Only Caleb watched him, his young face a mask of suspicion. He was looking for a crack in the man's armor. And I watched them all. I made lessons for the children at the big table, teaching them sums and letters, trying to create a small pocket of normalcy in the suffocating silence. Silas never interfered, but I could sometimes feel his eyes on me from the shadows of the room. It was an unnerving feeling, like being observed by something wild. My mind kept returning to the locked door. It was an obsession. I would find myself staring down the dark hallway, my imagination running riot. Was it a prison? A shrine? Did he have someone locked in there? The whispered name, Anna, haunted me. Was she his wife? A child? Was she the reason for the emptiness in his eyes? One afternoon, while Silas was out checking the far fences, I decided I couldn't stand it anymore. The children were outside, chasing grasshoppers in the pale sunlight. I walked to the end of the hall and stood before the door. It was solid, unyielding. The padlock was old and rusted, but strong. I ran my fingers over the heavy iron bolt. It was cold to the touch. I put my ear to the wood, listening, straining to hear something, anything. There was only silence. "What are you doing, Miss Vance?" I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Caleb was standing at the other end of the hall, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed. He had seen my curiosity, my fear. "Nothing, Caleb," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just looking." "He doesn't like anyone near that door," the boy said. "I saw him yesterday. He just stood here staring at it for a long time." We were partners in this mystery, this shared unease. That evening, a change occurred. After the silent supper, Silas didn't immediately go outside to smoke his pipe as he usually did. Instead, he went to a large dusty trunk in the corner of the room. He lifted the heavy lid, and for a moment, he just looked inside. Then he reached in and pulled something out. He brought it to the table and set it down in front of Lily. It was a small, crudely carved wooden horse. The legs were uneven. The tail was just a splintered nub, but it had been sanded smooth, obviously by hands that had spent a long, long time working on it. It was a toy, a gift. Lily stared at it, her eyes wide. She looked at Silas, then at me, as if asking for permission. "For you," Silas rasped. Slowly, she reached out a small hand and touched it. A tiny, fragile smile touched her lips for the first time since we'd arrived. The next night, he had another one. A little wooden bird for Finn. The night after that, a carved wolf for Caleb, its head tilted back in a silent howl. Where were they coming from? He was working from sunup to sundown. He had no time to be carving toys. It was as if they were just appearing. The mystery deepened. He was capable of this small kindness, this gesture of connection, yet he kept himself locked away behind a wall of silence. It was Caleb who found the next piece of the puzzle. He'd been tasked with cleaning out the tack room in the barn. It was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with old leather and the ghosts of horses long gone. Tucked away under a pile of stiff blankets, he found a small wooden box. It wasn't locked. He brought it to me that afternoon, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. "Look, Miss Vance." We opened it together. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were more carvings. A whole family of them. A mother, a father, a little boy, a girl with long hair, and a tiny baby wrapped in a blanket. They were just like the toys he'd been giving the children, but these were older, the wood darker with age. And underneath them was something else, a small, leather-bound book, a diary. The handwriting inside was feminine, elegant script. The first entry was dated 7 years ago, October 12th. "We have arrived." Silas calls it Crying Creek, but I think it will be a place of laughter. Our home. My hands trembled as I read on. The diary belonged to a woman named Maria, Silas Blackwood's wife. She wrote of their hopes of building a life in this wild place. She wrote of her love for her silent, strong husband, and she wrote about their children. Jacob, their firstborn son, strong and serious like his father. Anna, their bright, cheerful daughter who loved to draw, and little Leo, the baby, a boy, a girl, and a baby, a family, a life. The last entry was dated 2 years later, April 4th. The fever came in the night. Jacob is coughing. Silas is worried. He hides it well, but I see it in his eyes. There were no more entries. The rest of the pages were blank. I closed the book, a wave of nausea washing over me. The stew he'd cooked on our first night, the empty house, the obsessive cleanliness, the silence. It wasn't malice, it was grief. A grief so large and so absolute it had hollowed him out completely. The locked room wasn't a prison, it was a tomb. That evening the air grew thick and heavy. A storm was rolling in from the west, the sky a bruised purple. Silas worked with a feverish intensity, securing the barn, reinforcing a loose shutter on the house. There was a frantic energy to his movements I hadn't seen before. After our meal, he did something he'd never done. He sat down at the table with us. The carved toys were lined up in the center, a silent wooden family. "A storm's coming," he said, his voice low. "A bad one. You'll need to leave in the morning, Miss Vance, as soon as it breaks." "Leave?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Why?" "It's not safe for you here, for them." He looked at the children, his expression unreadable. "I'll take them into town myself when the road is clear." "But they're settled," I protested. "This is their home now." "This is no home," he said, and the bitterness in his voice was a physical thing. "I made a mistake. I should have left you all at the station." Before I could argue, the storm broke. The wind hit the house like a fist, and rain began to lash against the windows. The world outside dissolved into a roaring chaos of darkness and water. We were trapped. The storm raged all night. The house groaned and shuddered under the assault of the wind. None of us slept. Silas sat in a chair by the fire, a rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door, as if he expected the devil himself to come calling. The children were huddled in their beds, their faces pale in the flickering lamplight. I sat with them, telling them stories in a low voice, trying to drown out the howl of the wind. Sometime after midnight, there was a lull. The wind died down to a low moan. In the sudden quiet, we heard a new sound, a splintering crash from the direction of the barn. Silas was on his feet in an instant. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Don't open the door for anyone." He grabbed a heavy coat and a lantern and plunged out into the storm. We watched through the window as his small light bobbed and swayed, heading toward the barn. That's when Caleb looked at me. His eyes were wide, but not with fear, with determination. "Now," he whispered. "The key. He wears it on a string around his neck. I saw it, but there's a spare. It's on a hook right inside the main door." "Caleb, no," I said. "We can't." "We have to," he insisted, his voice trembling, but firm. "We have to know, Miss Vance. We have to know what he's hiding." He was right. The doubt, the fear, the not knowing. It was a poison. I couldn't protect them from a threat I didn't understand. And Silas was out in the storm, his guard down for the first time. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was wrong. It was a violation. But the image of that bolted door, of the empty diary, of the profound, suffocating sadness in this house, it pushed me forward. "All right," I whispered. "Be quick." Caleb darted to the main door, and just as he'd said, a small iron key was hanging on a rusty nail. He snatched it and ran back to me, his small hand pressing it into my palm. It was cold and heavy, the key to everything. We crept down the hallway, Lily and Finn trailing behind us, their small hands clutching my skirt. The house was eerily quiet now, the storm holding its breath. I stood before the locked door. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the padlock. It turned with a grating squeal that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. The lock fell open. I looked at Caleb. He nodded, his face grim. Together, we slid back the heavy iron bolt. The door swung inward with a low groan, opening into a pocket of absolute darkness. It smelled of dust and lavender, and something else. Something like preserved time. I held up my lamp, and the breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a dungeon. It wasn't a place of horrors. It was a little girl's bedroom. Everything was perfect, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment. A small bed was neatly made, a patchwork quilt folded at its foot. A little wooden chair was tucked into a small desk. On the desk, a piece of paper was weighted down with a smooth river stone. Books lined a small shelf on the wall. A single dress, faded blue calico, hung from a peg by the door. It was a shrine, a perfectly preserved memory. This was Anna's room. I stepped inside, the lamplight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb, Lily, and Finn followed, their eyes wide with awe and confusion. Lily, drawn by some invisible force, walked toward the bed. On the pillow sat a worn rag doll, almost identical to her own. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched its yarn hair. Caleb moved toward the desk. He lifted the river stone. I moved to his side and held the lamp over the paper. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, done in charcoal. It depicted three children holding hands, a tall, serious-looking boy, a girl with long pigtails, and a tiny little one, barely more than a toddler. They were standing in front of a crudely drawn house, this house. But that wasn't what made the air leave my lungs. It was their faces. The artist had captured them with a startling clarity. The protective stance of the older brother, the hopeful smile of the girl, the wide, innocent eyes of the youngest. It was Caleb, Lily, and Finn. It was impossible. The drawing was old, the paper yellowed with age. Yet it was them, an echo from the past, a perfect reflection. Who? Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse. Who are they? My children. The voice came from the doorway. We all spun around. Silas Blackwood stood there, silhouetted against the light from the hall. He was soaked to the bone, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. The lantern in his hand cast long, terrifying shadows. But his face was no longer a mask. It was a canvas of pure, bottomless grief. The wall of silence had finally crumbled. Her name was Anna, he said, his voice raw, broken. She loved to draw. She drew this the week before the fever came. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space. He wasn't angry. The energy that radiated from him was something far heavier. It was resignation, defeat. The boy was Jacob, he continued, his gaze drifting to the drawing in Caleb's hand. He was going to be taller than me, and the little one. That was Leo. He was just learning to walk. He looked around the room at the bed, at the little dress hanging on the peg. My wife, Maria, she kept this room just so. After Anna was gone, she couldn't bring herself to change it. Then when Maria and the boys, when they were gone too, I couldn't either. I locked it. I thought if I couldn't see it, maybe I could forget. He sank down onto the edge of the small bed, his huge frame looking out of place, a giant in a doll's house. The bed springs creaked under his weight. But you don't forget, he whispered, more to himself than to us. You just carry it. The story came pouring out of him then, a torrent of pain held back for 5 long years. He told us about the fever that had swept through the valley, swift and merciless. He told us of nursing his family, of the helplessness he felt as, one by one, they slipped away from him. Jacob first, then the baby, Leo, then Anna, and finally his beloved Maria, her last breath a whispered promise that she would wait for him. He had buried all 4 of them himself, on the hill behind the house, beneath the lone pine tree. The whole town. They tried, he said, his voice thick. The reverend, the sheriff, they came with food and condolences, but I couldn't. I couldn't look at them. Every sympathetic face was a reminder of what I'd lost, so I pushed them away. All of them. I built a wall of silence, and I lived inside it. He finally looked up, his storm gray eyes meeting mine. I wasn't looking for children at that station, Miss Vance. I was selling the ranch. The papers were all drawn up. I was going to take the money and just disappear. Ride until I couldn't ride anymore. My mind flashed to the pouch of gold. It wasn't for the ranch. It was from the ranch. I went to the station to tell the Reverend the deal was done, Silas went on, And then I saw them. The train pulled in, and I saw them. He gestured vaguely at Caleb, Lily, and Finn, who stood frozen, listening to this man's heartbreaking confession. It was like seeing ghosts, he rasped. An older brother, so protective, a sweet girl in the middle, a tiny one at the end. It was them, my family, given a second chance right in front of my eyes, when everyone else left, and they were the last three standing there all alone. I knew I couldn't let them be separated. I couldn't let my ghost be torn apart. He looked at the children, truly looked at them for the first time. I didn't want to replace my children. I couldn't stand to lose them again. The truth was so much bigger and more painful than anything I could have imagined. His silence wasn't cruelty. It was a shrine to his lost family. His isolation wasn't misanthropy. It was a shield against a world that had taken everything from him. He hadn't bought 3 orphans. He had saved 3 ghosts. But as the pieces fell into place, a new terrifying question emerged. "The gold, Silas," I said softly. "The money for the ranch. You gave it to the Reverend for the children's adoption fee." He just nodded, his eyes closing for a moment as if in pain. "But if you gave away the money from the sale?" My voice trailed off as the horrific realization dawned on me. You don't own this ranch anymore." He opened his eyes. They were filled with a grim, terrible clarity. "The banker, Mr. Sterling, he takes possession at the end of the week," Silas said, his voice flat. "I used the last of my money to make sure the 3 of them were legally mine. I figured if I lost the ranch, at least they'd have my name. They'd be a family. They wouldn't be sent back, wouldn't be split up. They'd have each other. It was the only thing I had left to give." The weight of his sacrifice crushed the air from the room. He had traded his home, his land, his entire world for 3 children he didn't know. He had made himself a beggar to keep a ghost family together. He had saved them, but in doing so, he had doomed them all to be homeless. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break over our heads. I had to do something. I couldn't let this happen. This man, this broken, grieving, noble man, had given everything. He deserved more than to be thrown off his own land. As soon as the storm broke the next morning, I was on Silas's fastest horse. I didn't ask permission. I just took it. I rode like a fury was at my heels, the mud sucking at the horse's hooves, my mind racing. I didn't have a plan. I only had a story that the town of Redemption needed to hear. I burst into the Reverend's study, my dress splattered with mud, my hair a wild mess. He looked up from his Bible, startled. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything. I told him about Maria and the children, about the fever, about the 5 years of silent, crushing grief. I told him about the locked room in the drawing, and then I told him about the sacrifice, about how Silas Blackwood had used the money from the sale of his ranch, his last resort, to save Caleb, Lily, and Finn. The Reverend's face grew pale. He leaned back in his chair, his hand covering his mouth. We all knew he lost his family," he stammered, "but he was so distant, so angry. We thought he blamed us, blamed the town. We just let him be." The guilt in his voice was thick. "He doesn't have until the end of the week," I said, my voice urgent. "He has until tomorrow. Sterling is a vulture. He'll be out there at dawn with the sheriff to evict him." "The sheriff," the Reverend breathed. He stood up, his purpose clear. "Come with me, Miss Vance." We found Sheriff Miller at the jailhouse drinking coffee. He was a good man, but a practical one. He listened to my frantic story, his expression growing grimmer with every word. "I remember that fever," he said, his voice low. "Wiped out half the valley. I tried to talk to Silas after. He nearly took my head off. After a while, you stopped trying." He looked down at his coffee cup. "Sterling's got the law on his side. The deed is signed. There's nothing I can do." "There has to be something," I pleaded. The Reverend stepped forward. "There is, Sheriff. Sterling's been running that crooked card game in the back of the saloon for years. Everyone knows it, but no one's had the spine to say anything. He's been fleecing ranchers out of their savings. I'd say that gives you a certain leverage. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. A slow, hard smile touched his lips. Leverage, he repeated. I like that word. He stood up and put on his hat. Reverend, go talk to some of the other ranchers, the ones who've had bad luck at Sterling's table. Tell them the story of Silas Blackwood. Miss Vance, you've done enough. Go get some rest. But I couldn't rest. The story was spreading through redemption like a wildfire. I saw it on the faces of the people in the street. I heard it in the urgent whispers coming from the mercantile, the blacksmith shop, the saloon. The guilt of a town that had turned its back on a grieving neighbor was a powerful force. The story of Silas Blackwood, the scary hermit from Crying Creek, had changed. He was no longer a monster. He was one of them, a man who had suffered an unimaginable loss and had performed an act of unimaginable grace. That afternoon, a strange procession started to form. It began with one wagon, then two, then a dozen. They were loaded with supplies, sacks of flour, crates of canned goods, tools, lumber, blankets. The women of the town had gathered everything they could spare. The ranchers were saddling their horses, their faces set with a grim resolve. They weren't just offering charity, they were coming to pay a debt. I rode with them, back toward Crying Creek. It was a caravan of hope, a stark contrast to my lonely, desperate ride that morning. We arrived at the ranch just as the sun was setting. Silas was standing on the porch, Caleb at his side. He saw the long line of wagons and riders approaching, and his face hardened. He thought we were a posse coming to throw him off his land a day early. He pushed Caleb behind him, his body tensing for a fight. But then the first wagon pulled up, driven by the blacksmith. He didn't say a word. He just started unloading sacks of grain onto the porch. Then came the millers from the mercantile, with boxes of food, then another family and another. Silas stood there, stunned into silence, as the people of redemption, the people he had pushed away for 5 long years, piled provisions on his porch. They worked quietly, efficiently, their actions speaking louder than any words of apology. The sheriff and the reverend were the last to arrive. The sheriff tipped his hat to Silas. Blackwood, he said, had a talk with Mr. Sterling. Turns out he's decided to take a long vacation, and he's misplaced your deed. The sheriff winked. Funny thing, we found an old ledger that says your property taxes have been overpaid for the last 5 years. The town owes you a refund. Enough to make you solvent again, I'd reckon. It was a lie, a beautiful, face-saving lie that everyone there understood. It was the town's way of making things right. Silas stared at the sheriff, then at the mountain of supplies on his porch, then at the faces of his neighbors. His iron composure finally cracked. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. The sound that came from him was a ragged, wrenching sob that carried 5 years of unspeakable pain. Caleb, who had feared this man, who had suspected him of every dark thing imaginable, did something extraordinary. He stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around the big man's waist. He just held on. After a moment, Lily and Finn came out of the house. They saw the scene, and without hesitation, they joined the embrace, their small bodies pressing against Silas's legs. A broken man being held together by the 3 little ghosts he had tried to save. The locked door in the house was finally open for good. It was no longer a tomb. It became a place of stories. Silas would take the children in there and tell them about Jacob, the serious big brother. He would show them Anna's drawings and tell them how she would have loved to teach Lily to draw. He'd tell them how little Leo was just learning to gurgle and laugh. The ghosts of Crying Creek were no longer trapped behind a bolted door. They were set free, their memories woven into the fabric of this new, unlikely family. The silence of the ranch was replaced by a new sound. It started small, a giggle from Lily as Silas carved her a new toy, a shout from Finn as Caleb chased him around the corral. Over time, it grew into the steady, comforting sound of life, the sound of a home. I stayed in redemption, of course. My schoolhouse was fuller than ever, and every few weeks I would ride out to Crying Creek. I'd watch Silas teaching Caleb how to mend a fence, his movements patient, his voice calm and steady. I'd see Lily leaving wildflowers on the 4 small graves on the hill, not with sadness, but with a quiet sense of belonging. The quiet cowboy wasn't quiet anymore. Not really. He still didn't say much. But when he spoke, his words mattered. And when he looked at his children, his three brave, resilient children, his eyes were no longer empty. They were full. The story of Silas Blackwood became a legend in redemption, a reminder that the deepest grief can be healed by the most unexpected grace, and that you can never ever judge a man by the silence he keeps. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.